All right, here we are. So we're going to talk about how John and Paul dealt with fame, right?
Yeah, fame and I guess money's part of fame, but yeah, just sort of how fame, I think, changed them. I mean, not to start on a morbid end, but I think fame killed John. I mean, if he wasn't famous, he wouldn't have been killed by a psychopath who, you know.
Yeah.
So and also John Lennon co-wrote Fame with David Bowie. So um I think there's a lot to talk about here. I know we always try and sort of start with a song choice as the title for this episode. So I always like to default to Beatles songs rather than John or Paul song, but I'll throw Fame out there, even though it's
Yeah.
considered a David Bowie song.
Yeah, I thought of fame too. It's sort of right on the nose there. But the Beatles song, I think, is Drive My Car.
Interesting. Why do you think that?
Yes, I'm going to be a star, baby, you can drive my car. It's kind of about sort of feeling your power as a star and how you can manipulate people, so
Interesting.
what-
Well, I love that, and I always think, and maybe this isn't relevant to today, I watched him do that song so many times because he did it in the Super Bowl. So,
oh, right.
that song to me is just like one of those. He's got four: Drive My Car, Live and Let Die, Hey Jude, and Get Back. Where I'm just like,
Yeah.
I've seen him play those songs so many times. I like it a lot. I don't really have a better choice for the Beatles. I think the other song that we should consider, which ironically we considered for another episode as well, is the song God by John Lennon off Plastic Ono Band. Because to me, that song really is about, all of these famous people or deities, whether it's Zimmerman or whether it's Hitler or whether it's Elvis or whether it's Beatles.
Who's
And
that
that's
Zimmerman guy?
Bob Dylan. So that's to me, in a way, a song of saying, I don't want to be famous anymore, even though that's not specifically what it was saying. But I think that's a good one. But again, I like the Beatles together. Now, we were going to kind of include Money in this, and if we are, then that opens up a whole bunch of songs, because then it's You Never Give Me Your Money and whatever. But it sounds like we're leaning more towards Fame. I'm going to defer to you. So for now, yeah, I think Drive My Car. I would have to think, because I intentionally don't come to this with too much predetermined thought. I like to let the conversation go wherever it takes us. And I'm trying to think of sort of later Beatles records, which is where the Fame thing would come in a little bit more closely. But nothing's coming to mind. It might as we continue to talk. I mean, I Me Mine is also an interesting one, but that's George, and that's not necessarily Fame. So yeah. So for now,
Yeah, I don't think they were particularly interested in writing about that, but yeah, I think Drive My Car is a fun one.
it is. And I think what's interesting about that one, if we want to use that as a launching pad, is that well, first of all, give me the ruling, because it's in my head. Is money part of this, or we're going to keep it to Fame, at least for now?
Yeah, I would say it's interconnected in there. Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
All right. Because if it's Fame/Money, I'm going to go with You Never Give Me Your Money. But if it's Fame with money in parentheses, we can go with Drive My Car. But let's talk about the difference maybe between those two songs. I think people always really, when they think about it, are freaked out by the Beatles. Really were together in most people's eyes for 6 years, 64 to 70. I know they were together before that, but they were in the zeitgeist, or they were a known quantity for about 6 years, which, if you think back, is crazy, because that's like 2017.
Yeah.
I mean, right? So but what's, I think, interesting in terms of this conversation is that Drive My Car is really, when you think about that song, it's from an innocent point of view. It's fun, it's frivolous, it's good. I'm not discounting it, but it's innocent. And just several years later, if you look at something like You Never Give Me Your Money or God or Fame, and part of that's John versus Paul, but it's just so much more cynical. It's so much more
Yeah.
adult. And I don't mean that Drive My Car is juvenile, but it's bouncy and it's fun.
Yeah.
And so yeah. And it's also kind of interesting and timely that as we're doing this, I just read about this, Paul in another way, I'm going to be cynical, Paul in another way to be relevant and make money and whatever is releasing this photography book, which I think is actually kind of interesting because I like to take pictures, where I guess all the Beatles were given a Pentax camera I think when they came to America. You would know better than me. And now he's publishing all those photos of his experience, but that was sort of the beginning of their fame. So, I like this topic because I think it's something that a lot of people aspire to, and then I think a lot of people get uncomfortable with. And I also think the difference between John and Paul is Paul never gets tired of fame. He loves it. He lives for it. And John, I think, probably loved it and lived for it too on the inside, but in the outside, he sort of, I felt like he was vomiting on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think probably like most people in their position, they started off really eager for it. And you can understand that, especially back in the early 60s when it didn't have all the oppression of fame now. I think maybe, although for those guys, it got as big as you could get. It certainly at that time, maybe ever. But yeah, I remember Paul saying, look, we signed up for this. We wanted this, to get to this position and then complain about it is a little bit too much. I can't really allow myself to do that. So, I think they were all in on, of course, the money and, the girls, and, that it's sort of, pretty basic stuff. And you want to get, they were saying we're writing for a swimming pool, and then we're writing for a house, and the car and all of that. And yeah, let's talk about how they dealt with it. I think certainly the craziness of the tours, I think, eventually started weighing on them, and all that, the screaming, and they couldn't leave their hotel room. I mean, it was just so out of control, and they had some hairy moments, Philippines and in the South of America. So then they got out of that. They said, okay, we're just going to make art. And, then Brian passes somewhere, soon after that. And then they go to India, which we've talked about previously. And that's kind of their way to detox from all of the fame stuff. And then they talk about how Paul, after Brian, he kept pushing the band forward. Let's do Magical Mystery Tour. Let's go back in the studio for this, that, and let's do a documentary movie, which ended up being Let It Be, and the other guys were more, you could say, lazy, or they just liked relaxing. They just wanted to kind of chill, and Paul was always the enthusiast moving them forward. So but then he hit his kind of bottom when the Beatles broke up, and then he got blamed for it and escaped to Scotland and didn't want anything to do with anybody for several months.
Yeah, I think though it's important to delineate between sort of, as you look at the chronology of the band, um, the work ethic and the money and the art and fame. I think there's a little bit of a difference. I think, like, to give Paul credit, he, even if he wasn't trying to be famous, which I think is important to him, he I think he had a tremendous work ethic. I think he loved making music. I think he loved the collaboration and the social aspect of his friends. So even though he might have wanted fame more than anybody else, he, um, I think it wasn't just that kept him going. Because I think fame and ego are really closely aligned, and Paul has a huge ego. I think even you would agree with that. But I don't think it was all about just we need to stay famous. I think it was, I like the work. It's all, to Paul, I think it's all positive. We're making money, we're meeting girls, we're making history. We're like, why would we not do this? I think what happens with fame is it becomes a super pressure cooker and you can't escape it. I've been around a lot of famous people, and, even I have friends that work for ESPN that are announcers, and you go out to dinner, and like every time we go out to dinner, somebody says something to them, which just means that everything you say, every time you're out in public, um, there's somebody that could scrutinize what you're doing and share that. And also, I mean, I guess thank God for the Beatles, they were around where there was no social media. Paul now is, around when there's social media. But so to be in that fishbowl, I think is like a drug. And I think certain individuals can handle the drug. And I think certain individuals are destroyed by it. And I think in a lot of ways, John was destroyed by it. I keep answer the question. I'm going to walk away for 2 seconds, but can hear you because my cat is just pounding on the door and it's driving me crazy, but continue.
Okay. Yeah, I think Paul was, I think not just between the two of them, but almost any rock star you can think of has handled it very well and has always been just kind of cool with it, and he talks about how he wants to keep going out in public and, taking the tube and, going on walks and stuff.
Does he take the tube seriously? Because I find that hard to believe.
Well, I can't
I
verify it in
I don't think he does that.
23, but he has said that he certainly said that in the 80s. And uh, I imagine, after that.
I'm saying no way, but I do think, and I don't mean to interrupt you, I do think he lives for the adulation and the fame, and I do think he wears it well. And I think he likes hanging around with famous people. I think that he was built for fame. He's
Well,
earned it,
yeah,
and
I
he's
just think
built for it.
he's really, he's got a good core in himself of confidence, I guess, and also maybe a spirit of generosity, and he's not intimidated by strangers. He's like, yeah, okay, he can have a little interaction with them. It doesn't, destroy his day or, ruin his moment. And he has a way of deflecting it and uh, uh, give people a little bit, but that's it, and we move on. And so I admire him for that. And John, of course, he moves to the States and New York in particular, and then he has that time in LA in 73-ish. And he's out, well, they call it the lost weekend, where I get, it was many months actually, but he was out partying and you could say making a fool of himself in some cases. And you know, he as we've talked about in other contexts, he had a drug problem. Now how serious his heroin problem was and how long lasting, nobody really knows. But I wouldn't be surprised if he kind of went on and off a bit for, you know, during the whole 70s. I know Yoko was dealing with it even in 1980. She was, you know, having a relapse into it. So you know, now Paul's a famous marijuana user, and certainly that, you know, that's in a way to escape too. So in a way you could say they both fell back on drugs as a way to escape. And I think Paul with his Scotland retreat, that was a way to escape for him. And I think Linda was a much more grounding personality. Nothing against Yoko, but she's a more forceful personality, I would say. Would you agree?
No, I don't think I would agree, but I mean, it's subjective, so I'm not sure I'm right. And you're more well-read on these types of things than I am.
Well,
My
you could just your impression. You know.
Well, in terms of the two women,
Yeah, like their influence on the guys in term, like I would say Linda was a grounding presence for Paul. Yoko was a stimulating presence for John.
I guess I agree with that. I do. I think though I want to come back to like fame, because a lot of what you're talking about definitely is a byproduct of fame, but in specifically looking at, I'm fascinated by fame because I think that fame is one of those things where you almost, sometimes it's because you're good and sometimes it's because you're lucky, and sometimes it lasts, and sometimes, as Andy Warhol says, we all are for 15 minutes. So I find it to be one of those things that are incredibly like specific to humanity and specific in a lot of ways to a particular time in history. Because this is not our legacy episode, right? We're going to do a legacy episode, but you know, Mozart is still famous however many years on, right? As opposed to, I mean, how much longer will certain sports figures be famous, right? So and then how much of fame is built up by the media, and how much of fame is sort of like the thing about the Beatles, and the reason I like doing this series together is everything we discuss was sort of the subject matter to the max, right? To the max. So
Yes.
we all know people who do drugs to escape. We all know people who have significant others who ground us or stimulate us. I think when we're talking about fame, what I find to be so extraordinary about John and Paul is that they were the driving forces behind something that arguably, and you suggested this earlier, will never be duplicated in terms of its critical
Right.
mass.
Right.
Right.
I always remember when they were doing the anthology and they were rolling that out. And George, in one of his interviews, he says, you know, one of the things I'm really looking forward to about putting this out is bands like U2 can see what a really big band truly was, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, he's absolutely right. You know, and U2 was huge in our lifetimes, but you know, yeah, there's just no comparison whatsoever.
Yeah, I also think George hated U2, but that's another thing. But, and by the way, I would think that U2 was acutely aware of how famous the Beatles were. But yeah, so beginning with the fact that they came over in 64 and the Ed Sullivan Show. I mean, just think about this. That audience for the Ed Sullivan Show, in terms of the way technology was then, and media was then, and television was then, like you don't even get close to an audience like that anymore, except for maybe the Super Bowl. So even even with doing the Super Bowl, like it was sort of like whoever we're going to choose has to have an inordinate amount of fame already, or else nobody's going to care. And I think it's harder these days with the diffusion of technology and social media and different creative opportunities, a la carte streaming models, et cetera, to become famous. I mean, I was asking my wife the other day, name me like a movie star under the age of 40. And there are some, like we could come up with them. We did, but it's not even like there's the Paul Newmans of the world and the Elizabeth Taylors of the world anymore. So these
Yeah.
four guys, go ahead.
Yeah, it's so diffused now. And yeah, and just looking at fame itself and the pros and cons of it, I guess the pros, you get access to people, and you get the good table at the restaurant, and you get that sort of just constant adulation that sort of enhances your ego, and that's probably the biggest buzz of it for people. On the downside, of course,
Well, hold on. Sorry to interrupt you. I think there's two big things that come along with it that, unless I didn't hear you, you didn't mention. One is money. Large amounts of money usually come with fame. And the other thing that usually comes with fame is some kind of validation of your work. Whether it's deserved or not, you're usually being validated in, like, I chose to pursue this path, and whether it was through YouTube or through an LP or through, the radio and a 45, we have achieved fame, which probably indicates to us that not only are we going to be able to get the swimming pool and the house and the cars and all that, but people are telling us we're really good. And I think one of the things about fame that's so interesting and was a huge, and I want to let you talk about the downside, but was a huge catalyst in potentially the breakup of the Beatles, is the pressure to remain as famous. Because if you don't remain as famous, then this drug of fame, less people are interested in you, you're not validated as much, you're not making as much money, and then the ego is sort of like, are we as famous as we used to be? And I think if you ask John Solo John and Paul Solo John, John would not be truthful to himself, and he would say, I don't care about that. And I think he absolutely would care about that. And I think Paul would be like, yeah, no, I do care, it's important to me. And
yeah, I mean,
that's the difference, I think, between the two guys.
Yeah, I think so. Paul was, he was asked, like, how do you know if something's good? Your music, basically, and he's like, well, I really just, I look at the charts, and if a lot of people are buying it, that tells me it's good. Now, of course, that's
I hate that answer. I hate that answer.
Yeah, it's not. That
I hate
doesn't.
that answer.
It doesn't exactly, work. It's a flawed argument, but I see what he's saying, and you could see in the 80s he's really chasing it. Like, he can kind of feel it slipping away, and so he's like, okay, Stevie, come be on Ebony and Ivory with me, and Michael, let's do something, and then he, of course, his hopes were just destroyed with his movie debacle in 1984, Broad Street. But I think he really was hoping that was going to take him to another level. And I think he got to the point where the albums weren't selling as much, but what he could always rely on is the live. When he started doing live again in the end of the 80s, that was always going to be his boost, and he would show his dominance, because he could always sell out, in anywhere, pretty much any time. But yeah, to just state the obvious on the downside of fame, you lose your privacy. And I'm sure we've heard many people say this. I particularly remember Harrison Ford talking about this, and he does seem he's a curmudgeonly guy anyway, but he was saying losing your privacy is a bigger deal than you might at first think. I mean, it's a really crushing gift to lose, and and like you say, there's levels of fame, and in the music business too. I remember, I know we're both Neil Finn fans, and his band Crowded House had some degree of fame, and in the early 90s, I guess they were having a band meeting or something like that, and the bass player said, well, do you guys want to be the biggest band in the world or what? And the other two guys, including Neil, just said, no, we don't. No, we don't want to. We don't want to be the biggest band in the world. And the bass player couldn't quite grasp that, but basically they're saying we don't want the hassle and responsibility that comes with that.
Yeah, I think also, getting back to Paul, when it's no longer about, and I don't know if this is germane to the fame topic, but when it's no longer about artistic credibility and it's about the charts, or it's about money, or it's about relevance, I think then you're in some real trouble. And I think if we want to use two bands or a couple of bands in the modern era and their sort of relationship to fame, and my interpretation anyway of it, is that you have, on the one hand, U2, who seems to be clinging to fame like a life preserver. It almost doesn't even seem to be about the music. It's just, how do we do something that keeps us famous? And then you have bands like REM who say, we're done. We don't need to do this anymore. Or Radiohead, who says, we're going to keep doing it, but we're going to do it in a way that's important to us. I think, the problem or the challenge of this one, to me, Paul, as we try and delineate sort of the John and Paul dynamic, I think if I had to sort of sum this one up, I think fame helped destroy the Beatles. Maybe they would have broken up anyway, because they didn't have the leadership, as you pointed out, after Epstein. Maybe they just spent too much time together and they just got on each other's nerves. But I think that fame definitely, and that the fishbowl and the lack of privacy and the pressure and the stress, I think it changed who they were as human beings. And I think Paul dealt with it a lot better.
Yeah,
than
I
John
think that's
did.
a very good point. And that, but I think there's the other side of that too, which is equally relevant. The fact that they did break up is also astonishing in the face of brand awareness and all of that. It's like I was going to say I'm sure, but I guess I'll speculate. I think Daltrey and Townsend and Jagger and Richards must have looked at those guys like, are you guys crazy? You're busting up this juggernaut, because you have a few personal issues. We got lots of personal issues over here, but we're not breaking up this money bank. No way. So in that sense, I give them credit for saying, fuck it, we don't care. We're gonna do it on our own. And they had to know it was going to be smaller on their own, and they were okay with that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up. And I've had the experience of being around those other two bands and seeing the dynamic between the Mick Keith and Roger Pete. I think part of this was the stopping of the touring, because I think that when you're touring, you can sort of take your separate buses and you can sort of, meet for 2 hours on stage, and, you don't really have to deal that much with each other. And both of those duos, Mick and Keith and Roger and Pete, got divorced and remarried a million times. I mean, so, and to your point, I think both of those bands were probably like, great, move out of the way, more for us.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it just had to do with, you brought something up earlier, which now I think is kind of interesting, and I didn't think about it at the time. I think a lot of the reasons the Beatles stopped touring was because they claimed that nobody was hearing them, that it was just girls
Right.
screaming. But a lot of it too was the intrusiveness. And I
Yeah.
think, because their professional relationship evolved to the point where it was essentially songwriting and studio work as opposed to touring, I wonder if they may have been able to make it a little bit longer, if they for some reason decided to continue to tour. But
Yeah.
regardless, I guess what I'm saying is sort of the if Drive My Car is the kind of beginning, and You Never Give Me Your Money is kind of the end. And I'm not saying we're saying that, but to me, they kind of bookend each other in a certain way, from, optimism to cynicism, both Paul songs. I think fame killed these guys, or at least killed them quicker than it would have if they were less famous, because I think the more famous they got, and I think this is more John than Paul, the more famous they got, the more they started to re-examine their own reality. And I think Paul, as we've talked about in other episodes, has always been very accepting of his own reality. He's intelligent, he's creative, he's brilliant, he's all those things, but I don't think he does a lot of self-examination. He's not an overthinker that way. And I think John's the complete opposite. I think John was constantly conflicted internally. I think Paul is very insecure with external opinion of him, but I think John was completely insecure with himself. And I
Well,
think fame just really exacerbated that.
yeah. And then, so that we also should give him credit for taking those 5 years off, from 75 to 80, and basically saying, I'm out, I don't need it anymore. And he was one of the true, he was authentic about that rather than just lip service. He really disconnected. He stopped doing interviews. He stopped doing everything. And so I think that's cool. And just one other touchstone for Paul, I think when he started Wings, he didn't get a super group together. He got sort of, no names really, and started by doing little gigs at university. So I think that was something cool. But yeah, by the way, did you ever see that movie Yesterday?
No, but I know the concept.
Yeah, I didn't see the movie, but was it that movie? I don't know. There's some movie where the character goes to meet John. John lived somehow, and he goes to meet John. He's at some beachfront, and he's like this older guy, and he I can't remember the whole backdrop of it, but basically he just lived a normal life for the most part. He might have put out some albums like early on in his life, but for most of it, he just spent it with his family and just, doing little, artworks and stuff. And that does make me think, and I do often wonder about this. If you could have put it to John when he was 18 or something like that, it's kind of, I don't know if you know that story with Achilles from Homer, where basically Achilles was told, you can have a very famous life and people will write stories about you, but you're going to die young, or you can go farm and live a long life, but nobody will remember you. I wonder if somebody went to John at 18 and kind of laid it out for him, like, you're going to have this most incredible, world defining life, but we can't say precisely when, but you're not going to live very long. I tend to think he would sign up for it still. What do you think?
Well, God, you said a lot just there, and I have a lot to say about what you just
What do you
said, but
think
I
about
think
that question?
that question, I think his answer would be, I'd give up the Beatles. His answer, maybe not what he really believes. His answer would be, I'd give the Beatles up in a heartbeat. To have a quiet, calmer life, to live longer, to see my children grow up.
When he was 18. Now, I'm saying, given this question,
Oh, when he was 18, he would have definitely taken the Beatles. Yeah.
yeah, okay, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Yeah. Just like Pete Townsend wrote, I hope I die before I get old. I mean, when you're 18, you sort of have this, I think most 18-year-olds would give it up, to live fast, die young, leave a good looking corpse, John Belushi type mentality. I do, though. I don't want to end with cynicism, but I have to say it's interesting the way you look at these guys, because I respect them and I'm a huge fan, but I don't give John credit for taking 5 years off, nor do I give credit for Paul being in an anonymous band when the Beatles broke up. I just sort of look at that as that was their journey. And I don't think in any way I don't look at that stuff as heroic. I look at that stuff as sort of, at the time, as a result of their fame, this was the best way they could cope. And I could poke holes in both. I could say that Paul was in a position where, I mean, look, it's I love the early 70s Paul, and I love the 1980 John. So I do think they both came out of these periods with some really good stuff. But that's 5 years of music we didn't get from John Lennon, which, I mean, if it made him
yeah, and
happier.
he would say, that's not my problem.
I know, I agree.
I don't live for you.
I agree. Yeah, no, I agree. But I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's heroic, like, like Joan of Arc, but it's noteworthy, because I don't think many people have done it, to just unplug at that level, and he did it for his kid.
Yeah, no,
apparently.
I can come up with others, but yes, there's not many. But I think so. Let's reframe it this way to just put a ending on this one. I think that the decision that, so if and I'm not saying you're agreeing with me, if we do agree, or if you think there's some relevancy to fame broke these guys up, or certainly was a contributing factor to breaking these guys up, I think
I agree.
I think it's interesting, as we have this series and we look at the differences of these two guys, that the examples you point out, specifically in this case, Paul with the no-name guys in the early 70s post-Beatles, and John in the 5-year period of, no public stuff. I think it's interesting that those were their reactions to fame and how they handled fame, because that's what I think is interesting about this phenomenon of fame, and my point of it sort of being a drug, and how do you achieve it? How do you handle it? Do you want to hold on to it? And I just think, as we, one of the things about our friendship that I enjoy is we read a lot of the same type of authors. We talk about movies, we talk about TV shows, we talk about sports. And it's just always fascinating to me to watch certain individuals who achieve this and how they achieve it. And then certain individuals who are desperate to keep it, and other individuals who are okay to walk away from it. And in each case,
absolutely.
I would imagine there's internal conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, and I do believe, I wouldn't want it. Now I think that's easy for me to say, because I probably don't have a chance at it. But I don't know. I'd like to believe, I do believe, if I did, I would turn it down. I mean, I don't it's not worth it.
I think
Not interesting.
the question becomes though, is it in the entertainment industry anyway, the necessary evil of seeing your work be successful? Because what if I told you, okay, then that means nobody's going to hear your songs. You're not going to make that much money. You're not going to be validated. In other words, the question is not, I think sometimes whether you want it. Yes, they wanted it. Of course they wanted it. I think most people want it. But sometimes maybe you want all of the things that come with it, and that's not the thing you want. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a sacrifice you have to make. Yeah.
Yeah, like let's say you were born with the innate ability to shoot, rebound, and dribble a basketball, and you loved the game, and you were a prodigy, and you became an NBA player, and you were phenomenal at it, and you were famous. Maybe you don't want the fame, but are you going to not play basketball? And
Right.
you know, like that. So even as we talk about like LeBron James or Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant, these guys become so famous, and yet maybe they wanted it, maybe they enjoy it, but it's because they were basketball players. So in the case of the Beatles, like, you know, yeah, I think they wanted fame, but they also loved making music and wanted to sell records and meet girls and all that. And you can't separate the two. Not in this field. So like in your field, you are very successful, but the field that you're chosen, yes, there are certain people who are famous in your field, but it's not a prerequisite like it might be if you were a
Right.
musician, an artist. So
Right. Like, yeah, in the corporate world, you can be very successful, but you don't have to be famous.
yeah,
You know?
I'm saying for them, it kind of came with the territory, whether they
Yeah.
wanted it or not. So also, like if I've known you for a long time, so my guess is you would have answered the question the same way when you were 24 years old. But certain people answer the question differently when they're 24 years old and when they're older. So
Yeah.
but anyway, all right, man. So I guess we're done, and I guess it's drive my car.
Yeah. You can drive.
All right, what's next time? Legacy?
Yeah.
Or is that our last one, or we have a couple more?
Well, that's the last of the core.
Of the eight. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, man. Peace and
All
love.
right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.